So welcome everyone to the School of Life Sciences weekly seminar at the University of Essex. And it's really exciting. There's lots of people arriving from not just in the school, but across the local area, but at the UK and elsewhere in the world because of the excitement around this topic at the moment about marine biology and marine conservation. And it is, brings me great excitement to introduce to you today Dr. Bryce Stewart from the School of the Geography and Environment at the University of York. And Bryce is going to be speaking to us today about his research that looks at the ecology, but also the management of the people and the nature involved in the coastal areas around Britain and possibly elsewhere, because he works in very many places in the world. So we'll wait and see what he's got in store for us today. In terms of house rules, there are very few other than when we get started and I hand over to Bryce, could you please go on mute? And could you please turn off your videos until after the seminar, because that reduces the carbon footprint of the seminar today, but it also keeps bandwidth down. And then turn them all back on again when we get finished and we have questions. I'm expecting the seminar to be about 35, 40 minutes, maybe just a bit more, which gives us plenty time for questions afterwards. If you have questions as they come up, just put them into chat if you like. If you want them to be recorded, I'll try and keep an eye on them and bring them in as we go along. And if you wish to, you can just come on to the speaker at the end and ask them directly to Bryce. And if we run out of time and you've got really good questions, I'll give you opportunity to send them to me and I can speak to Bryce about them at a later date and coerce him into trying to give us answers. So without further ado, remembering muting and turning off videos, I will hand over to Bryce. Bryce, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Tom. And yeah, great to see so many people here from some far-flung places as well. And yes, Tom, it was really good of you to arrange a Netflix documentary as well to promote this seminar beforehand. So yeah, hats off. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. So here we go. All right, so yeah, the topic for today is ocean optimism. Is there really hope for the oceans? As Tom mentioned, I'm from the University of York, from the Department of Environment and Geography, and you've got my email address here. I'm quite active on Twitter as well, so yeah, you can check out my various thoughts on there as well if you're interested. So since I think we could all do with a bit of optimism, I thought I would start with a good news story. And that is this one illustrated by these photos here. And this is Versova Beach in India. And we have the typical before and after picture. Now, what is quite amazing about this story is that this change really came from one guy called Afroz Shah. And he was a young lawyer. He moved to this area back in 2015. I guess maybe he got his sort of first good paycheck and bought himself an apartment, but he was pretty dismayed to see the beach in this state. And so together with one of his neighbors, they decided to try and clean it up, one sort of piece of litter at a time. And apparently for the first 6 to 8 weeks, no one helped them at all. So they would go out every few days and spend a couple of hours picking up this rubbish. In some places, it was like 6 feet deep. But eventually, after those 6 or 8 weeks, somebody said, can I help you? You know, can I have your gloves so I can pick up some as well? And it just completely snowballed from there. And over the next few years, something like 20 million kilograms of trash was cleaned from this beach, and it became this clean beach now. And apparently now there's a register with something like 50 or 60,000 people on it, who some of whom go out every weekend and keep it in this state. What is also more amazing is that for the first time in 20 years, olive ridley sea turtles have started to nest on this beach, and indeed the eggs hatch. So I think it just goes to show how incredible the marine environment can be and how it can recover if we give it a chance, but also the power of individual action as well. So I'll start with my personal story. And it goes right back to this sort of time here. I was born in Australia, but actually moved to Papua New Guinea when I was quite young. And here I am here looking, not that different. Um, Long time, this basically means in Pidgin English, which is the language of Papua New Guinea, means, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And I had a pretty amazing upbringing, as you might imagine, but it all really centered around the sea. And apparently, when I was about 5 or 6 years old, I said to my dad, I just want to be a professional holiday man when I grow up so I can spend all of my time at the beach and at the sea. And he was like, that's not really a job, but what about a marine biologist? And so that was it. I was hooked. Um, and, really my life has revolved around the sea ever since. And of course, through that upbringing in Papua New Guinea, I was lucky enough to see some extraordinary sights, coral cover. I can remember as doing my work experience doing coral transects and the coral coverage being like 150%, which is sort of hard to imagine these days. This is before coral bleaching was even a thing. This is in the early 1980s. And, incredible sort of marine life that I got to experience. But of course, it has been increasingly under threat since then. So yes, there are very significant global effects of fishing. So the latest statistics coming out from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization are that roughly about a third of fish stocks around the world are being overfished. That does mean that 2/3 are either at maximum sustainable yield or just below that. So we're really putting a lot of pressure on fish stocks. That figure as well has gone up from about 10% in 1990. So unfortunately, we are also going in the wrong direction. We know we've lost a lot of the large individuals, and in fact, some of the largest species, particularly things like sharks and billfish, have really suffered from industrial levels of fishing over the last sort of 50 to 60 years. We've got high levels of bycatch and habitat disturbance. Undoubtedly, these things are out there. That's consequently knocking on and affecting food webs and ecosystem function. And then, of course, we've got a growing global human population that is increasingly asking for more from the ocean. But while it's also being increasingly threatened by things like climate change and ocean acidification. So climate change obviously is, the sort of long-term change in the temperature of the ocean, among other things. But one of the other sort of possibly even more alarming effects are these heat waves. So it's not so much the slow change that's the problem, it's these extreme events like heat waves that are causing things like the mass coral bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef, or the loss of kelp in Tasmania, or Western Australia and California, and things like that. And then, of course, ocean acidification as well. Well, I don't think, well, it's not that I don't think, I know we haven't seen the worst effects of this. The absorption of carbon dioxide into the ocean is changing its chemistry. And that is effectively irreversible in our lifetimes. And again, it is going to get worse, and it's affecting calcifying organisms like shellfish, like corals, like certain plankton in particular. So I said this was going to be optimistic, but it's not sounding very optimistic yet. Then, of course, we've got plastic pollution, the public's favorite topic. And our man DA here has done a lot of good work to promote the issues around plastic pollution. We don't, to be fair, we know it's not good. We don't know how bad it is. One of the effects is not just the physical effects and possibly the, contamination through the toxins that it carries. It can also transport potentially invasive species around the world. This is quite an interesting observation. This appears to be the same plastic bottle that David's got in his hand here, except this was on the Great Barrier Reef and this was in the Seychelles. It's probably not the same one, but I like to think so, touched by the hand of David and all that. Although I'm sure he disposed of it responsibly. And then we do have issues around, for example, lost fishing gear. So you can see this unfortunate seal here tangled in a gill net. Um, lost fishing gear accounts for about 10% of plastic in the ocean. So that's quite a lot lower than you might have heard from other sources, but it is still a significant amount. And there's even been predictions that by 2050 there'll be more plastic in the ocean than fish. Now I think that's pretty hard to quantify because we don't actually know how many fish are in the ocean, but definitely it's a concern. You know, things are going in the wrong direction. So yes, you should always keep an eye out for plastic pollution when you're at the coast. That is a real photo. I did not set that up. That was down in Poole Harbour. So, you know, lots of bad stuff going on. Um, and yes, a certain documentary made the most of that. Now, I prepared this talk before that film came out. I'm very happy to take questions on it. I've done a lot of thinking about the film since then and a lot of fact checking. So yeah, feel free to ask me questions afterwards, but I'm not going to go through the whole thing in detail right now. What I would rather focus on is the more positive stories that are out there and the fact that we actually do need our fisheries. The world needs seafood, basically. You know, fish provides over 3 billion people with about 20% of their daily protein needs. In many places, it's literally the only option. You know, in island communities, in coastal communities, they don't have enough land, for example, to produce enough food in any other way than to turn to the sea. It's also integral to the culture and the history and the traditions of many people. Um, you know, think about the fact that even in the UK, fish and chips is considered the national dish. Look at all the attention that fishing got in the Brexit negotiations. You know, this is very closely connected, not just to people in the global south, but actually to people across the world. And yes, it is also socially and economically important. In the UK, roughly 25,000 people are employed in both the catching and the processing sector. And recreational sea angling as well is a big deal, arguably worth more than commercial fisheries. And not just in socio-economic terms, but of course, in terms of mental health and well-being. You know, some people might be familiar with the concept of blue mind, the mental health benefits that we get from being on, in, or near the ocean. And I think, you know, certainly from my point of view, it's very significant. On Monday night, I went to the beach. I drove an hour and a half after work because I just needed that bit of vitamin C. So there we go. Unfortunately, in the UK, but in fact, in many places, what goes on under the waves is out of sight, out of mind. And this is going back to a study done a few years ago now by Natural England. But particularly in the UK, people tend to have, you know, a pretty negative perspective on the local environment here, the local underwater environment. So in this survey, half of the English public thought their local patch of sea was barren, the sea was dirty and murky, and basically that they didn't value the English undersea landscape as a place, and that therefore it was going to be really hard to get, you know, the public behind marine conservation in the UK because people didn't really care about it. They thought it was knackered already, that, you know, all the good stuff was overseas and tropical places. And, you know, and a lot of the aquariums, for example, play into this by all their big tanks are full of tropical species. So when I first was putting this talk together, I actually sort of put this out there on Twitter and said, I want to show off some of the good stuff under the water around the UK. And I got sent a whole load of pictures. So here's one from the Isles of Scilly. I mean, this could be a coral reef. Check it out. It's amazing. Um, you know, this is down off the south coast of England. We can see some beautiful cuttlefish mating here. We've got wrasse, we've got tompot blenny. Um, and on we go. These are just pictures, you know, emailed to me from various different people. Cowries in the UK. Again, most people would think that they were a tropical species, or, you know, check out how colorful these wrasse are, for example. Even some things like place. That's quite a spectacular species when you actually see it underwater and not covered in batter. And on we go, lots of brilliant stuff. This was an interesting one, just about the amazing nature of marine life. So this is the same crab, and this was basically kept in a tank. I think this was accidental, but it's molted. So this is the previous shell, and then a couple of hours later, the same individual has grown something like 5 centimeters, and obviously, a lot in terms of mass as well. And you don't even have to go under the water. So these are some photos taken by me around, the Yorkshire coast, all within an hour or two. We have Donanook, an amazing seal rookery. We have Flamborough Head, one of the few no-take zones in the UK. We have Bempton Cliffs, where they're amazing seabirds. We even have whales. I mean, I've had one of the best whale watching trips of my life off the coast of Yorkshire. We saw 12 minke whales, for goodness sake. So there's lots of good stuff out there that is worth protecting and that is worth managing better. So in the rest of the talk, I'm just going to focus on some personal projects that I've been involved in, and highlight them as cases of successful management and how we can turn things around. So the first one is the Isle of Man. Now, this is where I came to when I first arrived in the UK about 20 years ago. And the Isle of Man is famous for its scallops, basically. So here it is in the middle of the Irish Sea, and all of these pink areas around here are scallop fishing grounds. You can also see this closed area, and that was quite significant, as we'll see. It was the only area that scallop fishing was not allowed. So scallops dominate the fishing landings into the Isle of Man. The fishery appears sustainable in that it did then, it was sort of going along at the same level, but it didn't, it certainly wasn't what it used to be. We were fortunate we had some historical data that showed that it was at a much lower level than it used to be. We also know that dredging for scallops has had a lot of negative effects on the seabed and on biodiversity, particularly on the main fishing grounds. But what they did do back in 1989, they set up this small protected area. And this was one of the things that sort of drew me to the job in the first place. So I arrived in 1999, and the closed area had already been going for 10 years then, but it hadn't been doing very much. So this is the density of scallops over time, and the sort of blue bars here are the numbers or the density in the protected area, and then the pink ones are in the fishing ground just next door. But we did see a huge turnaround, funnily enough, from when I arrived. And I'm not going to claim all of the credit for this. I think there was environmental sort of conditions that weren't favorable earlier on. But one of the big things that we did was we started to work with the fishing industry much more closely and communicate to them what this protected area was all about, that it could actually benefit their fisheries, and therefore they should stop fishing illegally in it, which was actually happening. Despite the efforts of the enforcement agencies, people were going in there at night, switching off their lights and doing all sorts of dodgy stuff. So we started to work with the fishermen. We started to hire their boats. We started to talk to them much more. And, they basically embraced it, and they started to not fish there. By 2006, there were 10 times more scallops in the protected area than outside. They weren't just more, they were much bigger. So this is the size of scallops on the bottom here. This is in the closed area, and you can see these are the numbers in each size class. They're massive, basically. In these bigger size classes, they are non-existent on the fishing ground. So biomass was 20 times higher in the protected area. And this is really significant for reproduction. So scallops are hermaphrodite. So the orange bit here is the eggs, and then you have the male part in white, and they're broadcast spawners. So they actually release their eggs and sperm into the water, and they rely on being near each other to fertilize. When you have bigger scallops, they have bigger gonads. in fact, disproportionately so. So we worked out that per unit area, the egg production was 33 times greater in the closed area than in the fishing ground. But because they're close together, the fertilization rates were much higher as well. We put all this into a model, and we worked out that in combination, these scallops in the protected area, this population was producing around 100 times more young scallops than the same area of the fishing ground. And this is all the stuff that we're able to communicate to the industry. And then Bangor University, I sort of moved on from that job, but Bangor University took it over. They started to model the distribution of the larvae. They spend about 3 or 4 weeks in the water. And we can see just from this little protected area off here that the baby scallops were going all over the Irish Sea, basically. And we started to see the catch rates going up, and the fishermen started to see that. So they really bought into this. And of course, we also had benefits for the seabed. We had increased biodiversity in the protected area, particularly of these more fragile animals. And this complex habitat actually basically sort of snowballed, and it generated a positive feedback in that it provided more habitat for other species, including things like young scallops. So we actually saw higher recruitment of young scallops in the protected area as well. So from this little area off Port Erin, there was only a few kilometres squared. The whole thing snowballed. And, to fast forward to 2018, the Isle of Man now has a very extensive network of protected areas. There's different regulations in them within its 3-mile zone, which it has full control over. So I call it the Marine Protected Area capital of Britain, or of the British Isles. It's not part of the UK, it's important to note. So good, they've named a beer after it, the MPA beer, which, it says here Manx Pale Ale, but obviously it's the Marine Protected Area beer, really. Anyway, moving on to my second success story. This is an interesting one, maybe a little bit controversial, but probably a few people remember Hugh's fish fight from about 10 years ago. And one of the things that he did was he highlighted the fact that in some fisheries, up to half of the catch was being discarded, basically dead. And, it wasn't all that bad, but there were definitely some really bad examples of what was going on. This was due to a combination of both the regulations, but also bad practice as well. And he really exposed this to the public and pressured politicians, including the EU, because they were undergoing a review, a reform of the common fisheries policy at that time. Now, I independently with one of my students, Ben Diamond, started looking at what they were doing in Norway, where they had a ban on discards. And we looked at how they made that work, basically. And as is often the case, you need a crisis, it seems, before people take radical action. So Norwegian fisheries in the late 1980s were in a bad state. And so they recognized that one of the problems was they were throwing away too much. And so what they did was they brought in this discard ban on about half a dozen species. This shows the profitability of their fisheries that actually took a bit of a hit for the first few years. But then if it's above the dotted line, basically they're making money. And you can see, and this has just gone on and on since then. So this has been both biologically and economically a very successful thing to do. Nowadays, they have some of the most prosperous fisheries in the world. Now, fortunately, I had met Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall a few times, and I was able to give him this research, and he was able to hand it to the European Fisheries Commissioner. Strange how these things work. And so it was really used a lot in the campaign to change this. I got invited to present it to the EU Fisheries Committee here. You might notice this blonde-haired chap. He's not the one you might be thinking of, but he is his dad. So that's Stanley Johnson. Exactly the same personality as Boris, it seems. Interesting. He made a lot of politically incorrect jokes about me being Australian, but we'll leave that for another discussion. Anyway, long story short, lots of people were involved. 100s of people campaigned for this, but the EU in its reform did implement a landing obligation or a ban on discards that started in 2015 and was then phased in over the next 5 years. Now, it's been definitely a positive move. It hasn't solved everything because it's not, it seems, being entirely adhered to, but it's definitely going in the right direction. And it's something that I think needs to be built on. And the UK in its new form with its Fisheries Act, independent of the EU, is bringing forward something similar. Okay, so moving on to my third success story, and this is one that I'm still very actively involved in. And this is the Isle of Arran. And these two chaps here, Howard Wood and Don McNeish. Howard was run a garden centre. Don was an engineer, but they were both scuba divers who lived on the Isle of Arran. They lived there for a long time, and they'd noticed basically they were seeing less stuff when they were diving. Then the seabed was being damaged. And they got an idea from a holiday in New Zealand that Don went on that they needed a no-take zone, a highly protected area. That was in the early 90s. They also fortunately worked out they needed to get the local community behind them. So they formed the Community of Arran Seabed Trust, and they campaigned for 13 years, as it turned out, to get a small no-take zone, no fishing zone in Lamlash Bay off the coast of the island. And it was quite an amazing achievement because it is the first and still the only no-take zone in Scotland. And it really came from this grassroots movement. Now, I fortunately met these guys back in 2004, I think it was, and they were looking for help. And they were so enthusiastic, I couldn't help but want to help them. And so I did. I supported them as I could in their campaign. But then after the area was designated in 2008, they got back to me like the next year and they said, no one's really monitoring this. We need to know how it's recovering. Marine Scotland did do one survey, but it was sort of quite quick and broad scale. And so I said, well, let's try and do something. We don't have any funding, but let's get a student up there. And that student was Lee Howarth. And here he is diving with Howard Wood. And they did the first survey of the no-take zone, a sort of comprehensive survey with scuba, and really everything built from there. So one of the first results that came out of this first set of surveys was that already only in a few years, the seabed was starting to recover, and they were seeing lots more young scallops on the actual growth that was on the seabed, and also recovery of some other species. So early on, we were already seeing positive results from that. So on the back of those first few years of surveys, the Community of Arran Seabed Trust, or COAST, campaigned for this much larger marine protected area. So here's the original one. And you can see this, it's actually 100 times larger. It's over 250 kilometers squared, the South Arran MPA. Originally, there wasn't any management measures in it. But again, through a series of campaigns, they managed to get scallop dredging banned completely throughout it. They allowed a sort of compromise in that there was some prawn trawling in these green areas, but then some other blue areas where no real fishing activity is allowed either. So it's really quite a sort of shift upwards. It wasn't entirely easy. There were campaigns from some of the local fishermen, not all, that's really important. Many of the small-scale fishermen fishing with pots for crabs and lobsters were right behind this marine protected area, but the scallop dredgers and some of the prawn trawlers were not happy. They tried to overturn the decision. You can see this is outside the Scottish Parliament building. Things got a little bit heated, but ultimately the Fisheries Minister, Richard Lochhead, stood his ground and went forward with these quite progressive management measures. So we've continued to monitor this area. There's lots of stats about all the surveys we've done and some headline figures about how it's benefited scallops and lobsters in particular, and also the seabed. So we will dive into that in a little bit more detail. So the first thing is the scallops again. I am known for my scallops. So for the first 4 years, the surveys didn't show very much recovery in terms of numbers. But when we went back in 2019, there was a huge jump. And what actually is interesting here is what was our control site then fell within the new marine protected area. So our control site actually ended up being protected as well. And we saw this huge increase in numbers in both places. So altogether, there's roughly been a fourfold increase in the numbers of king scallops from when we first started in 2010 until 2019. We did then have to set up a new control site, which is this one here, which is an area that's still dredged. And basically, there was a 2.7 times more king scallops in these two well-protected areas compared to this area that was still being fished. The scallops also were much larger and older as well, just like we saw in the Isle of Man. So, you know, providing not just more numbers, but a much bigger reproductive benefit as well. In terms of that bigger marine protected area, I think this is possibly even a more spectacular result. So we did some pre-surveys, or Coast in particular did, and some of my students. And this is before protection. So we've got king and queen scallops, the two key species. Queens are interesting. They're very variable populations. They don't seem to respond to these protected areas so well. They're quite mobile as well. But the king scallops, again, they went up over sixfold just in 3.5 years of protection. So we saw a huge increase. And this is basically because they weren't being dredged anymore. And so again, you can imagine that you now have not just a little protected area providing reproductive benefits like the no-take zone or even that small area on the Isle of Man. You've now got a huge area that is going to be providing small juvenile scallops throughout the Firth of Clyde. And of course, again, there's benefits for the habitat. A student last year, Amelia Allerton, looked at all sorts of different community indices and found that of the 44 she analysed, 36 of them were significantly higher in the no-take zone than on the area that was still dredged. We saw more juvenile cod, so the cod populations in this area have really suffered. So it's fantastic to see the juveniles starting to come back. And in that bigger marine protected area as well, you know, we've seen an 80% increase in the density of benthic fauna overall in just that 3.5 years of protection. This has not just been for those species that I've talked about. We've also done work on the crustaceans, and the lobsters in particular seem to be doing really well. So interesting, this is the no-take zone. You can see sort of, you know, between 2 and 3 times more lobsters. Again, they're huge. They're much, much bigger. But it doesn't benefit all species. And it seems like the lobsters are basically out competing the others. And their populations are really recovering. But, you know, not everything. And this is important to be realistic about the sort of recovery that we might see in these areas. Moving on, we've also done surveys of the fish using baited underwater remote videos. And, you know, Lee and I started off with this kind of basic system here, which this is an old lobster pot with a camera strapped inside. Glasgow University, led by Dave Bailey and some of his PhD students, are now using much more sophisticated stereo bruvs, and yeah, we've started working with them, and that's really revealing lots of other interesting information about recovery and also about sort of habitat associations. And that's one of the other benefits of these protected areas, is that it's an area where you can do some really important science in a relatively natural state. This has not just had effects on the Isle of Arran. They've actually been very, very influential right around the UK. They've been fantastic at sort of doing outreach work and getting a lot of media attention. Howard Wood, here he is out of the limelight, actually got an OBE in 2015 for his work. He won the Goldman Prize, which is a huge American environmental prize. He went to meet Obama. Unfortunately, Obama got called away at the last minute, but he did a tour of America. And on the back of all of that, they were able to build a visitors center on Arran. We've even got my kids here, like listening to this stuff and looking at videos about the marine life. I mean, that's quite something. Normally, everything I do is pretty boring. And they also inspired lots of other groups. So one of them is the Coastal Communities Network here, who we can see Coast at the bottom. And they've now become part of this network of groups right around the coast of Scotland who are doing similar things, having been inspired by Coast. I think it's also fair to say that they have influenced the development of marine protected areas, more generally around the UK. When I first arrived here, there were very, very few. Or I think there was 20 years ago. And now there is, in fact, as we will see, 372 marine protected areas covering, over 300,000 square kilometers, 38% of our seas. It looks amazing, right? Unfortunately, the story is not quite that good. So of the highly protected marine areas, there is just 21 kilometers. There's only 4 of them. One of them is up the road from your university in the Blackwater Estuary. So the only areas that basically completely restrict fishing make up only 0.0024%. So there is definitely work to go, room to improve on this front. But we are going in the right direction. Now we've got to make sure that we get decent management in these areas. They don't all have to ban fishing by any means, but they do have to go a lot further than they are at the moment. So finally, Brexit. And you might wonder why I'm talking about Brexit in a positive ocean optimism way, but hopefully I can show you. Now, I didn't, I'll come straight out. I didn't vote for Brexit for all sorts of reasons, but we are in the situation where it's happened and we need to try and make the most of it. And there were some interesting things that went on. The flotilla on the Thames, Boris getting a little bit too friendly with what's actually a farmed salmon, but ignoring all of that and moving on. One of the pieces of work that I was involved in is this one. Now, this shows the priorities of all different stakeholders during the sort of the period between when the vote happened and when we actually left the EU. So this study was, these surveys were done in 2017. And basically, if it's a 4 in a dark color, that means it's high priority. And what was really encouraging to see was the fact that right across the board, commercial fishermen, seafood processors, and obviously, everyone from managers to scientists, NGOs, recreational fishermen, all rated sustainability as their top priority. And I honestly don't think that definitely would have been the case when I came here 20 years ago, but possibly not even 10 years ago. So this is, people have embraced this concept. They know it's, not only the right thing to do, but in the case of fishermen, it's the best thing to do for their business as well. So yes, Brexit went on and on. We won't go through all the details, but fishing became incredibly important, somewhat bizarrely, given it's not worth very much money to our GDP. But to illustrate how important it is, Boris even wore a fish tie when he announced the deal on Christmas Eve. Great timing. That was the end of my Christmas holiday, but hey, I did have Christmas Day off at least. So what is the good news? Well, actually, through Brexit, what we saw was a new Fisheries Act, which has a lot of good stuff in it, that's actually shared in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So here is this commitment that not only have the UK government promised to maintain stocks at sustainable levels, the EU has said, yes, you have to do that or this agreement will break down. So I think this is more than just agreeing with them. This actually provides a check on the UK government. And there's lots of other good stuff in there as well, about being precautionary, you know, aiming towards long-term sustainability, following the science, protecting key areas, reducing illegal fishing, etc., etc. So a lot of good stuff came out of it in terms of the legislation. We now need to see it delivered, but at least all the framework is there. Brexit has also allowed the UK to have more control over what happens in its seas. And one of the things that means is that it can actually, for the offshore marine protected areas that it used to have to decide in collaboration with the EU, it can now actually make those decisions independently as long as they're not discriminatory. And so it's already started to propose some quite progressive measures like banning bottom trawling in some of its key marine protected areas as well. So that's really all from me. In terms of sort of carrying on this optimistic message, I think it's important to remember that, you know, there are good news stories out there and that we can also make a difference. And, you know, you could communicate these messages to the public, but I think as scientists and academics and NGOs, we also need to walk the walk as well. You know, we need to do what we can to combat climate change, thinking about our travel, reducing waste, choosing sustainable seafood. If you want to eat seafood, the MSC Eco Label is actually very reliable, despite what certain documentaries might have told you. The Good Fish Guide from the Marine Conservation Society is a great place as well. But also get involved. Again, you know, we can all not only make these individual choices, but we can get involved in projects like beach cleans, but also just get out there, you know, because when you get involved, immersed in your environment, then you learn to love it and you become even more committed to looking after it. So that is all from me. I have to finish every talk I give these days with the philosophy of a scallop. I think this is useful in many walks of life. So yeah, I'll leave that one with you. And other than that, just say thank you for all of your attention and happy to take any questions.